Yes, it is.
Hello, everybody. We'll just wait for people to get on here. Um, the call is being recorded, so make sure you consent to the privacy policy. And we're just going to wait 5 minutes and see who else shows up. If you want to, while waiting, please put in the chat what your organization is that you work for and your title. And that just helps everybody to know who they're on with today. Hi, Polly. Welcome. If you just want to put in the chat where you're from and your title, um, hello, Blanca. We're just introducing ourselves in the chat right now. Nice to see some faces. We're just introducing ourselves in the chat right now before we get started. Just kind of tell people who you are, where you work, and your title, if you could do that for us. I'm excited to see some new names and faces and also some returning peeps. It's always good to see familiar faces. Hi, Anna. We're expecting about 50 to 60 people today, so I think people might be running a little late, which is pretty common, but if you all could just introduce yourselves in the chat, that way people know like who's all together here. So when we start chatting at the end with our questions and comments, everybody has a sense of who's on. Okay, I really like to start on time, so I'm going to go ahead and get us set up for the slideshow, and then we'll get started. And anybody who is just now joining, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, if you aren't already muted, please go ahead and mute yourself. Can everybody see my screen? I can't see head nods, so somebody can just say yes.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, welcome, Nevada volunteers. The Governor's Commission on Service is doing your lunch and learn today. We are going to be talking about building and sustaining a successful volunteer program. I think the topic's really great for both people who are just beginning in their process of putting together their volunteer program, but also for people who have had volunteers for forever. It's a point of self-reflection for those who've been around for a long time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everybody if you haven't been to a lunch and learn. So excited to have some new people here. My name is Shannon Arimura. I am the Volunteer Generation Fund Program Officer for Nevada Volunteers. And so I get to work with all of the nonprofit organizations throughout the state for building capacity. These trainings are a part of that. I work primarily on volunteer initiatives and on our Governor's Points of Light Awards. I wanted to make sure that everybody here knows this is a lunch and learn. We set it up on purpose at lunchtime, so we expect you to be eating. Don't feel weird about that at all. And for the most part, while I'm presenting, I mean, most people aren't going to pay attention to it anyway. So, but we do like to see faces, so try to come off or turn your camera on after you're done eating if it weirds you out, but it is totally expected. We always welcome comments and collaborations. So although I do have 25 plus years experience in volunteer management, I am absolutely not the end all be all in knowledge. And so I love when other organizations jump in and give their opinion or their input and their expertise to help guide us along and collaborate. So also want to just put this out there that we do have opportunities for other people who work with volunteers to help us present these lunch and learns. So if you have something that you're particularly passionate about or very knowledgeable about that you want to share with other volunteer managers across the state, I would love to hear from you, and we can get you hooked up for one of our future topics. So the Volunteer Generation Fund is what I work with, just so everybody knows that it's a part of the Kennedy Serve America Act. It supports organizations to boost impact of volunteers on critical community needs. So we're building capacity around volunteer management. Essentially, those funds go through AmeriCorps, and so Nevada Volunteers applies for those funds. And then we were granted those funds, and then we turn around and subgrant those funds out to organizations within the state to help them build capacity, whether that is hiring staff that they couldn't afford before, recognition, volunteer software. It's all things volunteer management. These lunch and learns are a part of the training and technical assistance that we provide as a part of that program. But instead of just providing it to our subgrantees, we really want to lift up volunteerism in the whole state. I don't know if you know, but we fell back to 50th in Nevada out of 51 states in volunteerism, which is just incredibly sad to me because I know so many amazing volunteers that have such a huge heart and give up their time, but we do have work to do. And so that's what we're trying to do is build those capacities and bring on those volunteers. Please, if you have not, fill out your pre-assessment and return it. I have to give those numbers back to AmeriCorps for reporting purposes to say that these are the people who have actually gained something from being a part of our lunch and learns. Also, that pre-assessment can be utilized as a self-reflection tool. And I was so happy when somebody emailed me and said, "Hey, as I was filling this out, it really made me think about like where we're lacking and what we need to go back and look at in our volunteer programs." So if you don't have it, I will send out an email after this with a recap and how you can see the video, and I will include that self-assessment as well as samples for some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. So I think probably everybody knows what benefits of a volunteer programs are, and how much volunteers add to our organizations. They grow a nonprofit, help build capacity, improve the return on investment. They deliver services that otherwise you might have to pay for, especially those skilled volunteers and pro bono. And then they support. Um, Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. Support the necessary functions of the nonprofit. So when we can't employ as much staff as we want to, we're able to use those volunteers to really do the work that needs to get done in order for us to be successful. So the estimated national value of each volunteer hour is currently $29.95. And so we had an estimated 23.2% of Americans, or more than 60.7 million people, that volunteered between September 2020 and 2021, which I thought those numbers were absolutely amazing because we were still in COVID, and numbers were very low. But those are phenomenal numbers, which means that when we're out of COVID, they should just keep increasing. But they served an estimated 4.1 billion hours with an economic value of $122.9 billion. So it's not a small thing what our volunteers are putting back into our communities and the value of what they do. Now we're a little bit under that in Nevada. The estimated value of each volunteer hour here is 2618. And people are always like, well, why do we need to know this? It doesn't make any sense. But by placing value on your volunteer hours, you can determine proper resource allocation. And I have actually had those numbers are so inflated, they're ridiculous. Nobody would pay volunteers those numbers, or even if staff was in that position, they might be making $15 to $20 an hour. They're not going to make $26 an hour. And that's true, but you have to remember that your volunteers aren't paid. You're not paying them benefits. You're not putting into their 401k, you're not providing medical. So these are all the things that go into determining how much they would be worth. If you're not on mute, if you could mute your mic for me, that would be fabulous. So we are going to be talking about building and sustaining volunteer programs. Building is the groundwork prior to recruiting your volunteers. Now, obviously, if you're not a new volunteer program, these are things that you still need to be taking a look at and see where you might need to backtrack, do some strategic planning, and really figure out the best way to grow and sustain your volunteer program. So we're going to be talking about some of these things a little more in depth than others. And then, so this Lunch and Learn is really a precursor to the rest of the series where we're going to deep dive into some of these topics. So today we're just kind of going over why you need these things. We're talking about the what and the why versus the how and the when we really zero in on one topic, we'll really go into how those things should be executed and when to utilize them. So a needs assessment really should be performed each year, and that's whether So whether you're brand new and you're trying to figure out what you need, or your organization is 50 years old, it's going to keep changing as it grows, and so your needs are going to change. So that needs assessment that you did initially is it's just not going to hold true for you anymore. Hopefully, you will have met those goals, surpassed them, and moved on to new goals. And so you need the needs assessment to determine labor and skills gaps that can be filled by volunteers, as well as pain points and workloads and capacity within your organization. So, sitting down and really thinking about those areas and how you can fill them is going to help you determine how many volunteers you need, what type of volunteers you need, and resource allocation for those volunteers. Um, so for your needs assessment, you want to be talking about what your big goals and dreams are for your organization. That would require more money, expertise, people, or tools. And these things can be big, huge, totally like you feel they can't be attainable right now. But that doesn't mean that you can't get there. So sometimes taking your huge goals and breaking them down into years and goals that you can accomplish within the next so many months to get to one goal that leads then to another. But these give you a overall picture of where you want your organization to be in the future so that you can backtrack out and set those goals. What are some areas that you need additional support? So what department area and people are underutilized or understaffed, or they always seem to be completely overloaded with work? No matter what anybody does, they're running around like a chicken with their head chopped off. What can volunteers do to fill those holes? And what volunteers do we have in our pipeline that can be promoted to leadership positions? So we'll talk more about this later, but really volunteers are just unpaid staff, and they really need to be looked at that way. And so, the mindset of, oh, they're menial task doers that we have come for a one-time event and then we send them home, and they don't have the skills or the knowledge to lead anything or take over certain responsibilities within the organization. It's just a really kind of old way of thinking, and we can't really afford as volunteer managers to be thinking that way anymore. What specific skills is the organ sorry, I don't know why I do this every time. I have to leave my mouse alone when I'm presenting. Um, so what specific skills are we lacking, and can we find skilled or pro bono volunteers to fill those gaps? And do we need ongoing or one-time event support so that you know the type of volunteers that you're looking for, and who is or will be responsible for managing the volunteers and ensuring that there is enough resource allocation towards the volunteer program? A needs assessment will then lead you into your volunteer strategy, where you kind of deep dive into, okay, now we know how many volunteers we need, and we have determined what departments they're going to be in, and what responsibilities they're going to take on. Now we've got to have a strategy for finding these volunteers and placing them. And so this is a very, very short list of things that you're going to want to go over before you start recruiting. It's a huge list of things that you can be thinking about. But the important part, and what I wanted to get across, is there needs to be a strategy. So many times we have organizations that they don't have volunteer management staff. And so they are really winging it as they go. Okay, you're a project manager and now you're working on this huge project, and oh, you need volunteers to help you with this. And so, but now we have to complete the project. And so we're just really scrambling to find people. We're taking any volunteer we can find. I have been there a million times, so I know exactly how this feels. Without really all of the groundwork that needs to go into recruiting those volunteers and placing them so that we can retain them and make sure that they want to stay with us. So your strategy should lead you obviously into clearly defined volunteer roles and titles. So this is one of those things I was talking about where people have a tendency to, okay, we have an event, so we're just gonna recruit as many people as we possibly can, and you're all event volunteers, and there's no roles, there's nothing clearly defined, which to be perfectly honest, ends up causing the volunteer manager a lot more work than if they had done the groundwork before to make sure that um, these things were done. So don't forget, your volunteers are unpaid staff. They work for you. They are out there selling your mission. They have to follow your policies and procedures. Um, they work for you, but they're not being paid. So they need to be treated that way. And I know it's a really hard concept. I think it's kind of fairly new for a lot of people. But that's something that I'm just going to keep reiterating so people get that in their head. So no one is successful, paid or not, when they lack direction. So if your volunteers come and they don't understand what role they play or their value or what they contribute, they get very frustrated, and it causes stress and confusion. You want to avoid broad, vague, and shapeless position roles, like I said, like event volunteer. Um, Sometimes people just put out volunteer, or admin volunteer, but that's really not what they're doing, and they just picked a title because they wanted to get somebody in there. And again, I pointed out that treating volunteers as menial task slaves is the best way to demotivate them, and lose them. And we all know, I'm sure, that retention is way less costly in time and money, than recruitment is. So we need to do our best to hold on to these volunteers. So you want to create clear written volunteer roles with titles, that include stated priorities and responsibilities. So that gives structure to their work. So when they read that, they know what they're supposed to be doing and they know what their title is. Which leads you then into your volunteer position descriptions. And so I've gotten some funny feedback about volunteer descriptions. And so I just had to put this in there. But you're not gonna put out a position description for a job on Indeed or wherever, asking someone to apply for a job or expecting them that had vague descriptions of the responsibilities, didn't list whether or not the job was full or part-time, the hours that they were expected to work, what the benefits are, what skills are needed to perform the job, and where the job is located. There's no way you're going to expect that from an applicant for a job. And so you shouldn't be expecting that from your volunteers either. The position descriptions need to be very detailed and include all of these things so that when you get a volunteer in front of you, they already know that's the job that they're interested in doing, and you can talk about their skills and qualifications instead of having to have a 2-hour meeting that tries to pull the information from them. Also, having a volunteer description when you have people applying for these jobs ensures that you're getting people with a good fit. So if your job requires specific things like a driver's license um, or you can't have a felony because you work with vulnerable populations. Those things should be included. They also should be included on the application, which we'll talk about here in a second. The other thing that I want to talk about is but this is what it really means. So I have come across a lot of organizations who write very vague volunteer position descriptions. And then they get there and they think, okay, I'm going to be an admin. So I'm assuming that means I'm going to be doing filing or answering phones or, whatever admin stuff they need to do to help the organization. But in your head, you're thinking, oh no, I need you to do all these other things and type, whether it's pulling data or typing up letters, or it just needs to say what you expect. So they have a realistic expectation of what you're looking for. A volunteer handbook is really important. It doesn't have to be like this huge bound handbook. It can be short and sweet, but They really should have one. If your employees have a handbook, your volunteers should definitely have a handbook. And again, I said it, volunteers equal unpaid staff. So I have worked with organizations who utilize their handbook for both volunteers and employees. It has everything all rolled into one. It really aids in the volunteers feeling like they are a part of the organization, they're a team member, they are staff. And it also lends to the culture of the organization. So a lot of times people have problems with volunteers. They don't want to work with them. They don't understand their value. They think it's going to be extra work on them. So having the handbook that goes together really sets the tone and the culture for the organization that when you come in as staff, we have volunteers. This is how we work with them, and they're a part of our team. It should have resources that tells volunteers about the organization and how the volunteers fit into the mission. Um, you can have a physical or electronic copy for easy reference, but I will say please watch barriers to access. Um, Watch your volunteer population and um, be prepared for to have like printed handbooks on you. You're going to have people who don't have computers or they don't know how to use a computer. They don't have an email. They don't. There's just various um, access barriers, and then as well as cultural generational things that keep people from utilizing your stuff. So like for me personally, I have to print everything out. I have to print everything out and read it. I know it's awful for the environment. I'm sorry, don't judge me, but I can't, for some reason, comprehend and get the information to stick in my head unless I can read it, highlight it, write all over it. So these are things you just want to keep in mind. It's not a one size fits all for all of your volunteers, and we want them to feel like each one of them is special, and we want them to be a part of the team. So making sure that you're removing those barriers is important. Um, Handbooks, although they're going to be a pain and more time consuming in the beginning, they're actually going to help you out in the end because if your volunteers have handbooks that they can reference and utilize for certain trainings that they can take on their own, some people do it online, that's fine as long as people have access. But it also keeps you from having to answer random questions that people can easily look up on their own. So it is time saving in the end, and it also makes your volunteers feel more confident. Um, so it gives everyone, like I said, volunteer staff and even donors sometimes that want to see things like this, a clear picture of what your volunteers bring to the table. It also helps with word of mouth instructions and passing of incorrect information. So I don't know if you guys have ever been to an event where the volunteers are like, I don't know what's going on. And you got another volunteer over here who's, a very passionate leader, and they come in and they're telling them all this stuff, but it's just all completely wrong. And so your worst nightmare because if you can't catch them, they're going off to do the things and they're all going to do them incorrectly. So, having these things in place make sure that you don't have that issue. It also empowers your volunteers to do their best work. So some of the things that can be included in there, and this is a very small list, there's lots and lots of things that you include in your volunteer handbook. But welcome letters. I have been told more often than not that volunteers really appreciate a list of staff and board of directors with their contact information. Now, obviously, you have to have their permission from your board, but an email or a phone number, one or the other, whatever they're comfortable giving, then that way volunteers feel like they're able to contact and have access to the correct person instead of going through five middlemen to get to what they need to do to perform their duties. They also really like a volunteer directory. Some people volunteer, believe it or not, they don't, they don't really care about the mission. Not that they don't entirely, but really they're lonely and they're looking for that networking opportunity or to share that passion with someone else. And so it's important to make sure that your volunteers have the opportunity to network with each other. And so I did want to say that I did an orientation training last season on our last grant cycle, and it is included in our base camp. So it is a very it's a very deep dive into the whole orientation process, and it includes volunteer handbooks in there. And so I will send you all of the information on how to access those videos when we're finished, so that you can look at that, because it's not something we're going to go over this cycle. Volunteer orientation is really important. And again, there is that training. We have people who mix up orientation with onboarding, people who think that when you have volunteers who show up to an event and you do the, hey, we're so happy to have you here. Here's your job. This is what's happening today, and send them on their way, that is orientation. That is absolutely not orientation. That's day of training. And sometimes it's not even all that. But orientation is really important because it increases the confidence of your new volunteers, that because you're giving them all the information that they need to be successful and to understand your organization thoroughly. It also strengthens your public image, because your volunteers are going to go out into the community and they're going to be ambassadors for your organization. They're going to talk to people. And so you want them to have all of the knowledge in their hands so that they can do that and do it well. It does improve volunteer retention because people feel part of the mission. They feel part of your organization. That's really that team mentality. And so it improves retention. It also boosts the emotional connection. And here's where I talk about volunteers wanting to have that social opportunity. Um, and then there's others who are there because they really appreciate your mission. It also decreases risk, because this is your opportunity to really talk to volunteers about your policies and procedures, and what is expected of them, and what is appropriate behavior. And so that helps you to minimize risk. Volunteer applications and intake forms. These are really helpful. I think most of the organizations that I've talked to have a volunteer application. Some are online. Again, something to think about with barriers to access. But they assist you in interviewing and screening and placement, and it documents the basic information regarding the volunteer. So we're going to ask those for those things anyway: the address, the phone number, and all that kind of stuff. Um, you want to allow your volunteers to understand the required skills and qualifications, which we've already talked about. Make sure you're only capturing needed information and keep it simple. Um, there's no reason for a volunteer to have to fill out a 5-page application. There's things that you can find out in the interview. I know that we're trying really hard with our jobs, and some of us, volunteer management is only 10% of your time, 25% of your time. And so you're needing to move through volunteers quickly. And this is one thing that takes up time. But um, people are not going to fill out a five-page application. You need to consider the tone of your application as well. Um, it's still They're still staff, they're unpaid staff, right? So let's not have the super overly flowery, we love you so much and we don't care if you actually do any work here tone, because that's exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get volunteers that show up and have very little understanding of what you want, and they're not expecting to do a whole lot to get the recognition for what they've done. So your tone, while still needing to be inviting, does need to impress upon the volunteer that you need them to work for the organization and what they need to do. So I've just seen some really, really fluffy ones that kind of make me cringe. Um, and then avoid essay questions and answers, because this isn't a college test, and those are things that we can ask in person once we've got the application form back and we can tell that they meet our initial qualifications and characteristics that we're looking for. If they don't, then we don't need to go on to those things, and so there's no reason for you to have the questions already on the application. Volunteer management software it seems to be a really huge thorn in a lot of sides of the volunteer managers that I work with for my subgrantees. So volunteer management software is really important. It helps with planning, recruiting, and training, and it saves a lot of time in coordinating and scheduling when you need volunteers in. Um, It improves the relationship for the volunteer because they can easily look up a lot of the softwares have it so they can go in and schedule themselves. They can sign in and out. They can do everything they need to do without hand holding, asking questions, looking for that sign in sheet. Um, so I would always suggest, based on your budget and what you're able to afford, one that really works directly with the volunteers. There's the volunteer end, and then there's the rest of the data management for you on your side of things. We've just gotten so much feedback about how amazing it is to show up to an event, be able to tap on a tablet or whatever, sign in, and go on your merry way, without having to track an employee down or find that piece of paper. And then who loses those pieces of paper? I mean, there's so many when you leave an event that I will be the first to admit I have lost a volunteer sign-in sheet because there was so much and so many people, and I am not even sure if it got packed back up from the volunteer tent, because there's just so many things going on. So this saves you that problem. Also, I know a lot of people start out with they start off with Excel spreadsheets, but I just had somebody tell me they're going through the growing pains of moving everything over into from Excel into a new um, software, and so you have that problem. There's growing pains and learning, and um, I feel like if you can start with the software at the beginning, to just start with it, and then that way you don't have to backtrack. Also, a lot of these softwares are set up to specifically keep information that you need to be giving proper recognition. If you don't know how many hours your volunteers are giving you, how are you recognizing them properly? You absolutely should not be recognizing a volunteer that gives 10 hours in the same way that you're giving, or that you're recognizing a volunteer that gives you 200. There needs to be some sort of difference there. Also, relationship management. Volunteer management is relationship management, and showing that appreciation for your volunteers. A lot of these softwares keep track of anniversary dates with the organization, birthdays, and just personal information and things that you're able to um, recognize your volunteer for. Years of service is super important. So I'm a big proponent of volunteer management software. I know not everybody can afford it, especially the smaller organizations, but that's what they do. And we've had a lot of conversations about these. And so I've been trying to get some different software companies to come on and do a lunch and learn with us, but so far I'm not having a lot of luck. So if you have a connection, please let me know. Staff training. So it's really important to understand and identify staff resistance. So, some of the problems that staff have, especially higher up management, is that it's going to take way too long to supervise volunteers. They're a threat to our client confidentiality. They might be used as a justification for reducing budgets. We could have a volunteer come in that does a job really well, and they're afraid that it's going to replace them as staff. And so these are just some of the reasons why there's volunteer resistance throughout an organization. And things that need to be combated. So you can gain support through influence, asking staff to help design the volunteer program, and a deep dive into fears and asking for input and solutions to problems. So if a staff member says, I am unhappy with how much time it takes for me to supervise these volunteers doing these tasks, then work with that staff person to come up with solutions to the problem instead of just allowing them to stay in that negative mindset and think that volunteers are just awful. Clarify things, give some clarity, and make sure that volunteers descriptions are clear, because it not only helps your volunteer, but it's also going to help staff, because then staff don't feel like they have to go looking for answers. They know exactly who supervises them, what the policies and procedures are, how to mitigate risk. Those things are all really important to making sure that they're really comfortable, and making sure that staff know exactly what their role is in working with the volunteers. So that way they're not caught off guard, and they don't feel like they want to do those things. And appreciation, you want to show appreciation for your staff, just like you do for your volunteers. And one of the big trends now is to invite staff who work with volunteers to the volunteer recognition events that organizations are having. So that way, the staff that works directly with them is they're being recognized at the same time, and everybody feels all warm and fuzzy about what they've done and accomplished for the year, and that makes staff feel better about working with volunteers. You're also going to gain support through mission and vision. And so again, this is about company culture, but if you're utilizing a mission or vision statement that incorporates the importance of volunteers, then staff coming in automatically know that this is an organization who utilizes and values volunteers. And so they need to be of that mindset. This is an example of a statement. The achievement of the goals of this organization is best served by the active participation of citizens of this community. To this end, the organization accepts and encourages the involvement of volunteers at all levels in the organization and within all appropriate programs and activities. All staff are encouraged to assist in the creation of meaningful and productive roles in which volunteers might serve, and to assist in recruitment of volunteers from the community. So having something like that already, like front and center within your organization when staff is onboarding, just sets the tone. And then competency, ensuring that staff feel like they have all the training and skills they need to work with volunteers. As much as you can try to combat some of the fallacies, you're still going to have people who might not feel confident, might need a little extra training. So that's something that you might want to consider. Insurance. So I don't want to go into this in detail because there is a lot to this. These are the types of volunteer insurance that organizations should consider. I will say I have two things to say about this. So I hear all the time, we don't need this. We have our volunteers sign liability waivers. So my 2 cents on this: one, you're always going to have somebody that's going to find a loophole in your waiver. And so you open yourself up to liability that way. And you're sitting here thinking they signed a piece of paper and so they can't sue us, but it still does happen. And it is a huge drain on resources and time. But the second thing is like you're bringing people on into your organization to do all this work and help you achieve your goals, and then they get injured in the process, and you want to say, well, sorry, you signed a liability waiver. And what that says to me and other volunteers is, we don't care that you're injured or that you worked really hard for us and now you have an issue. You signed a waiver, and so sorry about your luck. And so that person is not going to want to stay. All volunteers understand signing the waiver. They understand that they are taking on or assuming some risk. But think about the way you're presenting that to your volunteers and what that looks like. If you are just trying to get out of purchasing insurance for your volunteers. So I personally recommend insurance. Resource allocation. So overcoming the fallacy that, well, volunteers aren't paid, and so there doesn't need to be a program budget. I hear this one a lot. I work with a lot of nonprofits throughout the state who have zero volunteer program budget whatsoever. So one of the ways to overcome that is to show your volunteer impact. And your ROVI, or your return on volunteer investment. So you need to come up with concrete numbers as to what your volunteers are doing, their exact impact within the organization, and then the return on investment for having them. Make budgets cross-functional, because that helps, instead of having one budget that is just specifically for your volunteer program, because that seems to be the one everyone wants to nix immediately. Instead, departments who utilize volunteers should have a volunteer budget within their department. And so that might help you to combat that a little bit. Recognition is a key line item. And the reason for the 3 exclamation points is that that's a main thing that I work with organizations. They don't have a budget. There is never a budget. They don't have a formal recognition plan in place. And so recognition happens if and when they're able, which recognition is a huge part of retention. And so um, it is a key line item, and you need to have some sort of budget in there for recognition. Um, it is less time consuming and expensive to keep committed volunteers than to recruit and train new ones. Ensuring that you have the right tools. Make sure when you're trying to set up your budget, that you have money for your software, your insurance, your supplies that you need to run your program. What tools do volunteers need to be successful? What training or consultation services will be needed for staff and volunteers? And then your volunteer program management staff is super important. So right now we know that in Nevada, based on a survey that we did, is that that is a huge problem. There is no volunteer management staff in a lot of organizations. It is other positions winging it and doing their best to keep up. But most of us probably know that volunteer management is a full-time job. There's just so many moving parts and so much to do. And the more volunteers you have, the more work it is. So make sure you're budgeting well for that. The sustaining pieces are really keeping it successful. Obviously, they kind of all mesh together in the before and the after, but some of these things we're going to talk about in more detail in the upcoming lunch and learns. So your formal recognition plan, which I mentioned, strategies for recruitment and retention, ongoing staff training, ongoing resource allocation. um, and so we're going to talk about some of these things more in depth. Your formal recognition program, again, it's a key element, and a formal plan needs to be in place to make sure that all volunteers are recognized for their efforts, that the recognition is consistent, equitable, and matches the effort. So again, you're not going to give a trophy to somebody who has 10 hours and somebody who has 200 hours. You also don't want to miss thanking some people and you're thanking others. And it needs to be consistent. And so having that formal plan in place is really important. And then there's a huge recognition training as well on base camp. That's where the orientation one is well, and I will send you that information after this call. So volunteer management is really relationship management. I'm sure a lot of you are well aware of this. The difference between a good volunteer program and a great program is relationship building and getting to know your volunteers. What are they passionate about? Why did they choose your organization? Have they been personally affected by the cause that your organization supports? What do they hope to gain from volunteering with you, and what motivates them? These things are all really important in order to make sure that your volunteers are happy, that they're placed in the right position within the organization, and that your recognition is on point, because some people aren't motivated by a coffee cup. So I have 5 million, they're dusty in a cabinet. And so for me, I'd be like, yeah, thanks, and shove it in a cabinet. So, these are things that help you stay on point with keeping your volunteers happy. Retention, according to the Corporation for National and Community Service, which is now AmeriCorps, the average volunteer retention rate is 65%, which means that 1 out of 3 volunteers will stop providing service to your organization. And so you don't want to just wing it. You need to have a strategy in place and have current volunteers help you build your strategy. Your volunteers see and understand firsthand the things that frustrate them, the things that aren't working, the tools that are missing for them to do their jobs. Please include them in your strategies. And the same thing with recruitment. Don't wing it and have your volunteers help. One of the best ways to recruit is to have your volunteers, out there recruiting to help you to ease your stress with your time and your costs. So always include your volunteers in your strategies. Building a progression pipeline. A lot of people that I work with do not do this, but it's a very big trend in keeping volunteers engaged within your organization. And moving them into different positions of ever increasing responsibility. So a pipeline is going to show the tiered volunteer roles that are available within your organization. And obviously, each tier has progressively more responsibilities, and as well as certain perks, just like a promotion for staff. So, what those perks would be is based on your organization and how you do things. But we talk about some of those things in the recognition training. This allows volunteers to move into leadership roles. It helps alleviate staff overload. Um, it allows volunteers to be motivated by people who see that their skills are great and utilized, and so they're being promoted. Allows volunteers to come fully engaged in the mission. And then it allows them to be an ambassador for your organization, because the higher up they go, the more they learn, the more they become ingrained in what it is that you do, in your mission. And so they can better go out and talk about, um, they're basically brand ambassadors for you. An evaluation, this is a super important part of your program. So you are not stagnant. You have constant moving parts. You're you're doing a million things. So evaluation is often overlooked and oversimplified, or people just don't have time to do it, or they say they don't have a budget. But it's impossible to understand the impact of your program if you're not evaluating it. So, did you set goals? Did you reach those? What gauge are you using to determine success? So, evaluations can also fix potential problems, that, like I said, volunteers know what the problems are. So, when you're evaluating and they're able to give their feedback, that that helps you to fix potential problems or enhance their experience. And you can also use evaluation, to fight for more resources from upper management. So these are my sources, which you'll have access to. There's a lot of them for this one. And they're great articles. So I'll send those out to everybody, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to go read some of that stuff. Upcoming lunch and learn topics. I did want to give everybody a heads up that we have changed the March lunch and learn. We've just kind of shifted everything down. But we really want organizations within the state to understand how to utilize AmeriCorps resources to expand capacity and impact. And so, if you need funding or you need P-Power to fulfill your mission, we want you to understand how AmeriCorps can help that happen. And so, we're going to go over, AmeriCorps and Vistas and NCCC, and I think they might be talking about AmeriCorps seniors, and then there's going to be a little blurb about VGF, but you guys already know about that. So I'm hoping a lot of you will attend and maybe get something really awesome out of that, and start getting some awesome researches or resources from AmeriCorps. The following topics, then I just shifted everything down. So in April, we're going to talk about those volunteer position descriptions, really get down into the nitty gritty of what that looks like and what are good versus bad descriptions. Recruitment and public relations, screening, placement, orientation. You guys could read these, but if you are passionate about any of these topics and you would like to help me present, I would love to have you come on board. So please let me know. And that is it for our slideshow. So I will stop sharing. I feel like I just talked your heads off for an hour and or more, and to forever and ever. So now's a really awesome time for if you have questions, if you have feedback, if you'd like to give your 2 cents about anything you heard today, we would love to hear from you. Or if everybody just wants to go on with their happy day and be done with the training, I get that too. I did a lot of talking. Nobody has questions or feedback? Happy busy day. Gotcha. Um, Okay, well, I'm just going to let you know that we have some amazing resources at Nevada Volunteers. I'm going to send you guys a huge email with how to get access to all of these recordings. And I have some I have some examples of orientation and applications and things like that. I will post in there for you to peruse. And I'm here if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns. And I hope you have a fabulous day.
Thank you,
Don't forget your
Shannon.
pre-assessments. Thank you. I'll hunt you down for your pre-assessments. Just saying. Bye, guys.